Munich, the 27th of August, 1845. The Jews of the city rejoice as Bavaria's own rabbi Max Lilienthal marries his sweetheart Pepi Netra after an all-too-long engagement. For the past several years, Lilienthal has been working tirelessly with the Russian Ministry of Education to bring Reform Judaism and modern Western education to the long-suffering Jews of the East. In his letters to Pepi, Lilienthal has been glowing with enthusiasm for the project, and it's expected that the young couple will soon be off to spend the rest of their lives in St. Petersburg. But it's all for show. For over a year, Dr. Lilienthal has been trying to leave Russia. His joyful letters home have only served to hide his true intentions from government censors. And though his allotted vacation time is coming to an end, he is never going back to Russia. Between 1772 and 1797, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was gradually eaten away by its neighbors, Prussia, Austria, and most especially Russia. For those who are just tuning in, Poland had historically been one of the safest and freest places in the world for Jews. And while Poland had declined politically and economically over the preceding century, and the growing movement to give Jews full equal citizenship in other countries made Poland's system of Jewish autonomy look increasingly old-fashioned, it was far better than what awaited them as subjects of the Russian Empire. Initially, the Russian Orthodox Church had requested that Empress Yekaterina the Great expel the Jews, while Baltic merchants who had worked alongside the Jews for centuries requested that they be allowed to stay. As a compromise, Yekaterina confined the Jews to the lands Russia had annexed from Poland, which was gradually expanded to include areas conquered from the Ottoman Empire and other border territories, and placed them under the direct administrative authorities of the regional rabbinic courts known as Kahals, which were a holdover from the Polish Commonwealth. This area came to be known as Cherta Osiedlosti, or the Pale of Settlement. Additionally, Yekaterina forbid the Jews from living in the same neighborhoods as Gentiles, restricted Jewish votes in local elections to count as only 1/3 of a person, and raised the tax rate on Jews to quadruple that imposed on ethnic Russians. Jewish life in the Pale showed initial signs of improvement in 1801, with the ascension of Yekaterina's grandson, Alexander I. He abolished the quadruple tax on Jews, and in 1804 produced the Regulation on the Settlement of Jews, a 54-point manifesto that supposedly secured certain legal rights for Jews in the Pale. But don't put too much weight on this decree. The commission that produced it based their recommendations on the assumption that Jews were foreign undesirables who presented an inherent threat to the Russian state. Although the regulation guaranteed and even expanded some rights for Jews living in most cities, it outright prohibited them from owning businesses in rural villages and imposed severe penalties on non-Jewish landlords who tolerated their presence. This was briefly interrupted by Napoleon's invasion of Russia, but once Napoleon had been defeated, the rural clearances resumed. In fact, Alexander went on to expel Jews from the cities of Kiev, Mykolaiv, Sevastopol, and Yalta. Altogether, between 1804 and 1823, Alexander removed 200,000 Jews from cities and rural estates, creating a massive homeless population which, to the frustration of the emperor's ministers, lived mostly off the books, their whereabouts unknown. Paradoxically, at the same time that Alexander was clearing Jews from some rural areas, he also created programs to resettle them in others. Because Jews were never agricultural peasants tied to the land, only a small percentage were farmers, feeding into Russian stereotypes that Jews were too insolent and lazy to work the land. Alexander hoped to remedy this by establishing Jewish agricultural colonies on the southern and eastern fringe of the Pale, an area known as Novorossiya. And unexpectedly, these colonies were so massively popular, with around 100,000 participants, that the lands made available were almost immediately sold out. Meanwhile, one place where the restrictions of the Pale resolutely did not apply was Poland. Following the defeat of Napoleon, the great powers agreed that the continued existence of a Polish state was necessary as a buffer against Russia. Admittedly, the Russian emperor was made king of Poland, and it was always clear that Polish independence would inevitably collapse, But the great powers hoped that Poland's liberal nationalist aspirations would act as a poison pill against Russian aggression. Though Jews remained unemancipated in Congress Poland, as this kingdom came to be known, they continued to enjoy far more political and economic freedom than in the Russian Empire proper. When Poland revolted against growing Russian domination as part of the revolutions of 1830, Jews successfully petitioned the Polish government for the right to serve in the army. And while many thousands enlisted in the regular forces, thousands of others established the Jewish City Guard, a collection of local civil defense groups who fought to the very end. Even after the uprising was defeated and Poland was annexed into the empire, Poland's Jews largely remained free from the strictures of the Pale. By that time, Alexander had died unexpectedly from typhus, and for reasons we do not have time to get into, the throne passed to his much younger brother Nikolai, who shared none of Alexander's pretenses to enlightenment, and began, in earnest, a policy to not only expand the Russian Empire, but subsume its constituent peoples into a single culture that Education Minister Sergei Uvarov defined as orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality. Today, we recognize this as the first phase of the policy later known as Russification. Until the Revolution of 1905, there was no such thing as a Russian citizen. The concept of rights did not exist, and whatever power any class of people may have enjoyed, even the Russian aristocracy, was a privilege granted entirely at the discretion of an absolute emperor. Under Nikolai's doctrine of official nationality, each ethnic group, or narodnost, was categorized into three distinct tiers. At the top were the All Rus, Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians. The main goal for this group was to eradicate Ukrainian and Belarusian culture and identity, dismissing them as merely that of wayward Russians whose sense of self had been compromised by centuries of Polish rule. Beneath them were basically all other Europeans, for whom the goal was eventual integration into the Russian Orthodox Church. At the bottom were the Inorodtzy, non-Europeans, and this is the group that included Jews, Armenians, Tatars, and many others. However, even among the Inorodtzy, Jews were placed in a unique category by virtue of their spiritual status as defined by the Russian Orthodox Church. To quote historian Michael Stanislavski, other national or religious minorities could be persecuted as enemies of Mother Russia or the Orthodox Church, but only the Jews were automatically and irrevocably regarded as the eternal arch-enemies of Christianity, the universal alien usurpers. It's for this reason that, even after the 1905 revolution established the concept of Russian citizenship, Jews, and only Jews, were explicitly forbidden from obtaining it. Now, this shouldn't be taken to mean that Nikolai or his ministers had any grand plan for the Jews. Russification policies were implemented sporadically, usually one at a time. But by far the most notorious of Nikolai's policies was implemented almost as soon as he took the throne: the Statute on Conscription Duty, better known as the Cantonist Decree. In other countries, conscription into the national army had been a signifier of the Jews' emancipation. For Nikolai, it was a tool for their eradication. Previously, Jews had been banned from military service on the assumption that they were too weak and cowardly to be good soldiers, instead being required to pay additional taxes to substitute their service. But as a true believer in the ennobling power of the military, Nikolai maintained that any man could be made into a great soldier. The only challenge in making one out of the Jew was to eradicate his Jewishness. Under this new law, the Kahals were charged with sending between 4 and 8 boys per 1,000 Jews into military service every 4 years. The exact quota varied over time. After serving for a minimum term of 25 years, Jewish soldiers would be uniquely eligible to live outside the Pale of Settlement and work in the Russian civil service. But conversion to Russian Orthodoxy was required to obtain commission as an officer. Jewish men between the ages of 20 and 25 would be subject to regular service, but those under 20 would be conscripted into the Cantonist battalions, a once elite military force created for the Russian aristocracy, but which had since devolved into a dumping ground for underage criminals. For all other Cantonists, the draft age was 18. For Jews, it was lowered to 12, the idea being that subjecting a 12-year-old to a 25-year term of military service would completely divorce him from his native culture and make him more susceptible to proselytizing. Most Jews in the Pale were married by 15, and it was difficult for the Kahals to justify conscripting husbands and fathers. The Kahals also saw conscription as a useful way to dispose of their poor and their political rivals, exacerbated by the few wealthy Jewish families remaining in the country, who still reserved the right to buy their way out of service or claim exemptions through membership in merchant guilds. Eventually, rabbinic administrators began dispatching thugs known as chappers to kidnap the needed amount of children, and while most were at least 12 years old, some were in fact as young as 5. As many as a third died of illness and exposure just on the march to their training facilities hundreds of kilometers away. Those who survived the journey had little better to look forward to. Initially, the Cantonist decree had guaranteed freedom for Jewish soldiers to conduct their own religious services, and prohibited officers from infringing on that freedom. But as the rate of voluntary conversions turned out to be far lower than expected, these religious allowances were soon abandoned. Jewish services were made off-limits to child soldiers, who were also prohibited from contacting local Jewish communities where they served, and were banned from writing or speaking Hebrew or Yiddish, even privately. The only meat provided to recruits was pork, and all other food was cooked using lard. Eventually, Cantonists were required to attend regular sermons by Orthodox priests. However, these priests complained to their superiors that the Jewish children were better versed in scripture than they were, making them unsuited for conventional means of proselytizing. So by the 1840s, with Nikolai's blessing, Cantonist officers had resorted to torture, with child soldiers regularly being starved, burned, held underwater, forcibly dehydrated, thrown downstairs in a sack, tortured with needles under the fingernails, and denied medical care until they agreed to convert. By July of 1845, the rate of conversion in the Cantonist battalions had risen to more than 50%, to which Emperor Nikolai proclaimed, "Thank God." But despite the cruelty, paranoia, and desperation that the Cantonist system produced, the total number of Jewish Cantonists was never more than 3% of the empire's Jewish population, and were being recruited at a rate far below the Jewish birth rate. To Minister for State Property Pavel Kiselyov, it was clear that the Cantonist system was a failure. I mean, not enough of a failure to stop doing it. But despite its failings, the Cantonist program had exposed severe divisions in the Jewish community along lines of class and religiosity which had until now been invisible to the Russian authorities. And this created an opening for a more creative approach. At the same time all of this had been going on, Jews in Western Europe and the US had been rocked by the emergence of Reform, Conservative, and Modern Orthodox Judaism. While most Russian officials had ignored these developments, Kiselyov and Education Minister Sergei Uvarov had been watching them closely, and concluded that reforms in Jewish education and religion could be a core element in the broader policy of Russification. Now, if that doesn't quite make sense to you, that's because it doesn't make sense. The Enlightenment had never come to Russia. What Kiselyov failed to recognize was that the Reform, Conservative, and Modern Orthodox movements went hand in hand with Jewish emancipation, universal rights, a social contract between citizens and government. Concepts so alien to the Russian political mind as to be practically invisible to it. Accordingly, Kiselyov had convinced himself that introducing modern Western-style education, with all of its critical thinking and pluralism, would somehow transform Russia's Jews into unquestioning, obedient servants of the Russian state. Uvarov was a slightly different story, and kind of a confusing one. While Uvarov was in large part the mastermind behind Russification, his vision for the future of Russia's Jews was at least much more progressive than that of anyone else in the government of the time. As someone who adored Western culture, even as he struggled to understand some of the ideas behind it, Uvarov was, like the West at the time, fascinated by ancient civilizations, and viewed the Jews as a once great civilization laid low by centuries of persecutions. Persecutions that had succeeded in humiliating the Jews, but could never succeed in erasing them. He was perhaps alone among his peers in recognizing that Haredi reactions towards the Haskalah, or Jewish Enlightenment, were not to be taken at face value, nor that liberal Jewish criticisms of the Haredim should be read as rejections of Judaism itself. So whereas Kiselyov had successfully sold the idea that the Haskalah was a gateway to Christianity, Uvarov envisioned his program for the Jews as preparing for his vision of a future liberal Russia in which his own ideas of Russification would no longer be necessary. And if some Jews converted to Christianity as a result, that would just be an added bonus. Now, the Haskalah wasn't totally alien to the Russian Empire. Even its founder, Moses Mendelssohn, had at times enjoyed a cordial and constructive relationship with the Vilna Gaon, the archetypal Eastern Jewish traditionalist. Yitzhak Ber Levinson, the so-called Mendelssohn of Russia, continued to campaign passionately for improving the treatment of his people by both the Russian government and the Kahals, through activism, religious commentary, and satirical comedy. And during the reign of Alexander, the newly built Black Sea port of Odessa, with its close proximity to the Sephardic communities of the Mediterranean and the Maskilim of the Austrian Empire, became a haven for Jewish nonconformists, who grew the Jewish community there to become the second largest ethnic group in a city already famous for its diversity. All the way back in 1817, Odessa's chief rabbi, Berish ben Yisrael Osher, had been murdered by an angry mob, not of Christians, but of Jews, who had grown exasperated with his dogged insistence on continuing to police Jewish law. But until now, those had been exceptions. The Kahals, perhaps understandably, never regarded Odessa as anything more than a lawless backwater of criminals and heretics. Levinson spent most of his career being boycotted by his fellow rabbis for accepting a government grant for his first book, Deodah B'Yisrael, feeding into a growing paranoia that any supporter of Enlightenment must have been a covert government agent. Most other Russian Jews who embraced the Haskalah fled to the West as soon as they could afford it. Nevertheless, a new generation, disillusioned by ultra-Orthodox gatekeeping, found themselves increasingly empowered to bring Enlightenment education into the country. In 1839, the Rabbinate of Riga obtained government permission to open a Western-style school led by a recently ordained Reform rabbi from the University of Munich named Max Lilienthal. Now, while the Council of State had passed a law requiring Jewish children to have a standardized education through these types of schools, the law as written was basically unenforceable. To date, only 3 cities in the entire empire even had these types of schools, each with fewer than 100 students. But with the Council of State now preparing to revisit the issue, Lilienthal had barely settled in at Riga before being whisked off to St. Petersburg to advise Uvarov on how to bring Western education to the entire Pale. Unfortunately, Lilienthal's reading of the situation was often just as fanciful as Uvarov's. In 1841, Lilienthal wrote to the leading Maskilim in the West that if there were enough rabbis willing to move to Russia and teach in these proposed schools, the Russian government was prepared to fast-track Jewish emancipation. Uvarov had made no such promise, but his exuberant predictions did bring enough teachers to Russia to begin the program. From there, Lilienthal took his proposal on a tour of Vilnius and Minsk to gauge public support. In both cities, he was embraced by some, particularly the young, and initially he was received warmly by the local rabbinates, if only because they wished to convince him that he was naively collaborating with a regime that didn't actually have the Jews' best interests at heart. But in both cities, public debates on the subject quickly devolved into riots, and Lilienthal was lucky to escape with his life. The following year, Uvarov sent Lilienthal on another tour, and this time he was successful in bringing together the country's most important Jewish leaders for a council in the style of Napoleon's Sanhedrin that would review and approve Uvarov's proposals for Jewish schooling. But Napoleon's Sanhedrin this was not. Representing the Hasidic contingent, Menachem Mendel Schneerson, grandson of Schneor Zalman and third Rebbe of Chabad, was fiercely outspoken in his opposition, not only to Uvarov's proposals, but to the very concept of Jewish enlightenment, and especially to Lilienthal.
These matters are not known to the ministry from their authentic sources, but from the corrupted wellsprings of atheists and Torah illiterates. The Ministry of Education has no authority over Jewish law and custom.
Ultimately, only the Maskilim were pleased with the outcome of this council, and only very briefly. On the 13th of November 1844, the Council of State passed the law on establishing special schools for the education of Jewish youth. Over the next decade, 71 so-called crown schools were established in 45 cities. Primary students were subject to study for 22 hours each week, comprising religious studies, math, geography, history, calligraphy, Hebrew, Russian, and German, with secondary students taking on the additional subjects of science and economics, and 2 state-sponsored rabbinic seminaries requiring 4 years of general education courses. Only rabbis from the West would be allowed to teach in these schools, hence the requirement to learn German. But at the same time all of this had been going on, Emperor Nikolai had issued a decree banning Jews from living within 53 kilometers of the Prussian and Austrian borders, allegedly to prevent smuggling, but more likely to counteract Uvarov's apparent favorability toward the Jews. Repeatedly, Lilienthal had attempted to use his clout to appeal against this law, but it was no use. Then, Uvarov refused to accept Lilienthal's resignation, keeping him in the country long enough to witness the passage of an even more draconian decree. On the 19th of December 1844, Emperor Nikolai officially dissolved the Kahals, abolishing the power of Jewish courts to enforce Jewish law or administer their communities. And while that might seem consistent with the values of the Maskilim, keep in mind that this was not paired with Jewish emancipation. The Jews would instead be under the direct governance of the imperial crown, placing each individual Jew at the mercy of the emperor. Although some of the clauses of this law proved difficult, if not impossible, to enforce, the message was clear, and Lilienthal secretly began making plans to leave. Finally, in the summer of 1845, he was allowed several weeks' vacation to return to Bavaria and marry his fiancée, Pepi Netra. During this vacation, he mailed his resignation to Uvarov and fled to the United States. The simple fact is that the basic assumptions on which Nikolai's Jewish policy was based were simply wrong. Enlightenment education didn't leach the Jewish spirit out of students. Instead, they brought their new knowledge and skills back to their communities. Introducing religious pluralism didn't tear Jewish communities apart. Instead, it fused with the ancient Jewish tradition of argument and deliberation to create a uniquely robust political culture. Only the Cantonist system was able to inflict lasting damage on the Jews of the empire. But even then, the Jewish population was growing faster than it could be Russified. And in the end, the biggest victim was the Russian military. Beginning in 1850, Emperor Nikolai began massively increasing the quota for Jewish recruits with the eventual goal of invading the Ottoman Empire and reasserting Russia's supremacy over France as the protector of Ottoman Christians. This, of course, resulted in the Crimean War, with neutral Austria occupying the contested vassal states of Moldavia and Wallachia, while Britain, France, and Sardinia rallied in support of the Ottomans, taking on Russia in the Crimea, the Baltic, the Caucasus, and even the Pacific. Despite having a much larger army, as well as some severe logistical failures on the side of the Allies, the Russians proved no match against modern weapons, ships, and communication technology, and sued for peace in 1856. By this time, Emperor Nikolai was dead, and although his son Alexander II had initially continued the war, this catastrophic defeat at the hands of the supposedly ailing Ottomans had convinced him that the continuation of serfdom and the policies of Russification, which were intended to strengthen the Russian state, had only weakened it. And Alexander wasn't alone. Upon Nikolai's death in 1855, his chief censor wrote that the main failing of the reign of Nikolai I consisted of the fact that it was all a mistake. Pursuing a more liberal approach, Alexander reversed many of his father's edicts against the Jews. Not only had Nicholas's increase in the Jewish quota failed to provide more soldiers, but the utter disorganization and logistical failures of the war suggested that maybe children don't make for an effective fighting force against modern armies. So the Cantonist program was scrapped. For those Jews already in the Cantonist system, coerced conversion ceased, and no fewer than 8 Jewish soldiers received officer commissions without converting to Russian Orthodoxy. And while he did prohibit Jews from buying land, Alexander removed all special taxes levied against Jews and allowed all Jewish secondary school graduates to live outside the Pale of Settlement, resulting in the establishment of the first ever Jewish communities in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and for some reason Siberia. Nevertheless, the Jewish communities of the Pale could never return to the way things had been before Nikolai, or even during the days of the Polish Commonwealth. While the crown schools hadn't weakened Russian Jewry, it had still divided them, pitting a previously unthinkable alliance of Hasidim and Mitnagdim against the liberal, westward-looking Maskilim. Granted, the Hasidim and Mitnagdim remained in the majority, and Reform and conservative Judaism never really took hold in the Russian Empire. But from the perspective of the traditionalists, the Maskilim had won. Western education had become standard. Secularism was on the rise. That robust political culture, which had previously been limited to radical outposts like Odessa, was now permeating almost every community, and would fuel the next half-century of Jewish political movements worldwide, and many non-Jewish ones. Perhaps most importantly, the influx of Western Maskilic ideas demolished the conventional wisdom that Jewish suffering was simply a tribulation of exile. Rather, it had come to be recognized as a human injustice, which could and should be challenged. Unfortunately, when reactionary authoritarianism inevitably returned to the Russian throne, the means of Russification would be far less high-minded than before. Special thanks to my patrons, including Mir Akbar Ali, Jeremy Biskind, Boris Cherny, FC, Jay Fleischman, Osher Gordon, Bob Huddy, Raphael Kellerman, Eric Liederman, and Sergei Gerasimov.